Hey, what's up guys? This is Anthony from AnthonysCustoms, and for this review we are looking at the Figma Fire Emblem Fates CORRIN. This is the female version of CORRIN, which is the only one they've released so far, so probably don't need to specify that. But either way, I got this figure because it's a Smash Brothers character, and you guys know I'm always interested in building out my Smash collection. And before you ask, can I show you my Smash collection? I cannot. It is not with me. It is halfway across the country still. Hopefully that gets remedied sometime soon, but in the meantime, we can at least look at these individual figures. So here's CORRIN. Let's go ahead and get her off the stand so we can take a closer look. This figure stands roughly 14 centimeters, pretty close to that, which makes it just about 5.5 inches. So that's pretty close. Now, of course, that's going to depend on how you have her standing, but it's going to be somewhere close to this. Now, first things I want to point out, the paint on this figure, it's pretty good. The paints are pretty clean, probably good enough. It's not the most detailed design in the world, but what is there does look pretty nice. The sculpt is pretty much okay. We have a few issues, but that mostly comes down to articulation, so I'm not going to worry about mentioning that here. So sculpts and paint are pretty good. So let's go ahead and talk about accessories. It's not very good on accessories. We only have two faces, one that's kind of smiling and then one that's yelling. As for hands, we have the two fist hands that come on her in the package, two sword gripping hands, and then two different sets of style pose hands with open fingers and then less open fingers. The only other accessories we get for the standard release are a little blue gem and her sword. I guess you can count the Figma display stand if you want to, but that's kind of standard. Now this is the pre-order bonus version, which I got from Good Smile directly, which has the different version of the sword, which is a cool accessory, but it's not all that much different from the standard sword, and they both look pretty cool. But that's it. It's a very light on accessories, given that the price point is relatively high. I think that's no bueno. Now, as far as the articulation on this figure goes, it's actually also not the best. There are some things that are fine, but some things that are really not good. One of which is the head. It sits very, very high on the neck because of how they did the articulation. It's got your standard ball hinge in there, but it pegs into the back of the head right here, and it makes the head sit way high in any kind of useful pose. And then it's also not that useful for posing. You can see as soon as you look the head up, make the head look up, you get a huge gap in the neck. The head's way too high, and it doesn't even have that much range. And then if you want to turn it side to side, you can. So I guess that's okay, but it's very creepy the way the pivot is very high up on the head. So it kind of looks like her neck's broken. It's just weird. It can rotate, of course, so that's fine, but it's not a great design otherwise. For the hair, we have one hinge that lets the entire chunk of hair go back. These pieces right here are soft plastic, but they are actually connected to this hair. So instead of hanging down and kind of filling that gap, they have a cut in the hair up here so that it flexes and just looks bad. I don't understand why these extra pieces are glued on. They should definitely be separate pieces, but they're not. Now while we're here, we'll go ahead and take a look at the cape. Each half of the cape has a ball hinge back here, which is fine. It's not the most useful thing in the world because it's so drastically separated, but they do function technically, so that's okay. And the bottom part here is where you'll peg in the display stand. So it's not the worst thing in the world, but it's kind of awkward to pose effectively. For the shoulders, we have extending shoulders so they can pop out a little bit, and then you can push them back in, and that does technically give you a little bit better range, but not all that much, so it's kind of useless. So you get a ball peg, and then you have your ball hinge, which is recessed inside the sculpted shoulder, which is actually pretty nice. Your bicep swivel does function in there, and the way it's sculpted, you get pretty good range out of that bicep swivel. If you need even more, you can actually rotate this joint as well, but you really shouldn't need it. The elbow will swivel, but you don't really need it. You have better than 90 degrees, so that's pretty good. And then your wrist is just your standard ball hinge, which is functional enough. It's nicely done though, because it's nice and smooth. There's no huge gapping or anything like that, so I'm okay with it. Now for the ab crunch, we actually just have kind of like a Revoltech joint where we have one hinge in there with a straight peg going into the upper torso, one going into the lower torso, and then this is just a floating piece that kind of moves around. So you do get a little bit of a bend, but not too much. The ab crunch is pretty minimal, and then rotating it side to side is almost impossible. You're really just going to get this kind of rotation. So I guess I should have said leaning side to side is almost impossible. Not very well executed. Yes, it looks nice, but very poorly implemented. This piece down here, it's two separate pieces. They're actually glued on to the lower piece. This is a separate one which will move around. So her hips are designed just like all Figma's. It's an upside down T. So you have a ball peg for either hip and then one going into it's actually the crotch area. So the thighs can move around on that ball peg. You get your thigh swivel, but the limitation going out to the side is pretty severe. Not quite even 45 degrees, so it's pretty limited. Going forward, it's not terrible because of how this is split, but on this side it's not great. And on this side, it's not that much better. They didn't give her the best of range. For a fairly flexible, dynamic character, it's going to be fairly difficult to pose this one. It's kind of a bummer. For the knees, they're okay. They're your standard Figma knees. They're not particularly good, but they're not particularly bad, so I'll give it to them. Being all black kind of hides it pretty well, so that's okay. Then for the ankles, we have your standard hinge. So it goes back, it goes forward. Doesn't really go forward very far, though, so that's a bummer. You can rotate it a little bit for an ankle rocker, but again, it's not that far, so it's kind of a bummer. And then we have a toe hinge, which is okay. It's not bad. It's not the worst in the world. So ultimately, it's not a bad figure, but it's fairly mediocre, and it does have a few problems, and it is at a pretty high price point. So I have to say I'm fairly disappointed with it. It's not one that I'm particularly happy to have after having it. And then you can see it also constantly makes you kind of like lean back. The neck's way far back on the body. The shoulders are pretty far back. You have to lean her forward, and it's just really awkward. Look how far back her neck is and how long it is. Her neck is as long as her bicep. It's like the whole upper arm. It's just weird. It's not a particularly good figure, guys. If it was at a lower price point, I'd be a little bit more lenient, but it's not. So there it is. I'm not very pleased with it. I don't think many people will be. So there it is, guys. Thanks for watching. Make sure you subscribe to the channel. I have new videos up every single day. We talk about action figures, movies, TV shows, video games, all kinds of fun stuff. So make sure you come back for that. Give the video a thumbs up if you liked it. And in the meantime, keep collecting.